Today in the Fabulous 413, Chinese spy balloons have once again engendered a bit of interest nationally, but we'll hear about how a UFO sighting in Sheffield got the attention of the Great Barrington Historical Society and former Governor Charlie Baker.
And Dave Hayes, the weather nut, the Florence-based meteorological hobbyist with 52,000 followers in Western Mass and beyond on what this evening's storm has in store
Bad
for
things.
us. But first... John W. Olver, born on a cattle farm in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, a 15-year-old graduate of his high school who went on to study chemistry at Rensselaer, Tufts, and MIT, who became a chemistry professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and who would then leave academia to run for office. His obituary reads, Dateline, Amherst. A workhorse, not a show horse, is what John W. Olver's campaign called him in a phrase that closely matched his unflashy but solidly productive political career. Olver, who served both chambers of the Massachusetts legislature and the United States House of Representatives for a total of 44 years, died on February 23, 2023 at age 86 at his home in Amherst. The obituary continues, much admired by his constituents and colleagues for his intellect, broad vision, hard work, and attention to detail. Olver devoted himself to progressive causes and to supporting progressive candidates. Joining us are two of those candidates that he supported and whose careers were launched out of his offices, as well as a well-known author and friend who also helped to corral some of these well-known legislators that join us today. Former Northampton Mayor David Narkowitz, who was mayor for about 10 years in the city of Northampton between 2011 and early 2022. Massachusetts Representative Natalie Blais from the 1st Franklin District, elected in 2018, and the well-known author Patricia Lee Lewis, who, according to her bio, spent much of her life as an advocate for women, for civil rights, for peace, for a healthy environment, and for small farms and rural community, as well as the arts, and all of whom were aides to and friends of the late Representative John Olver. First of all, thank you all for coming in, and I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you also very much, Monty.
Let's start with John Olver as a legislator. When you think back at your time, and I'm speaking to the elected or formerly elected members here, David Narkowitz and Natalie Blais, when you think about John Olver as a legislator, what is something that you'll remember most about him or inspired you most about him, Natalie Blais?
John Olver was the most unlikely of politicians, but he was so effective in what he did every day because it was never about John. It was always about his constituents. It was about the communities that he served, and you felt that authenticity when you talked with him.
Is that what was unlikely about him? Because the whole workhorse, not a show horse type of thing, and that's rare, or?
Well, you just don't. When you meet him, you would just never expect that he would be an elected official. And he was so smart. Not saying that politicians aren't smart.
Although I know a few.
We've had some questions as of late for reasons.
Yes.
But his educational background shows he was just such an intelligent person. And what he brought to the position with that intelligence was a deep desire to really dig deep on any issue that came before him, to fully understand it, to tease it out, to turn it inside out, so that the solution that we came to was always the very, very best. And it brought as many people to the table as he possibly could so that you were able to move it across the finish line. He identified who those stakeholders were, and really did an extraordinary job of bringing people together.
What about you, former Mayor David Narkowitz? When you think of John Olver as a legislator, what are some things that you'll remember about him?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Natalie and, sort of the anti-politician. I'd worked on the Hill prior to working for John, and I'd worked for several other members of the House, and he was definitely, unlike any member of Congress I'd worked for, but definitely as smart as any of them and as dedicated and and just his commitment to the issues and his willingness to take tough stands long before many other, whether we're talking about, gay rights or abortion or anti-war. I mean, he was, so I heard somebody use the term like uncorruptible. Like he had his views and there was nothing that was going to change those. He had a core set of principles, and then he, as Natalie said, had this grassroots approach. It wasn't top-down solutions from Washington. It was get out in the community, bring people together, talk to the municipalities, talk to the CDCs, talk to the folks at community health centers, like what do we need for this district? And then he just had an uncanny way of taking all that data and information and translating it into policy and into projects and into, and empowering staffers to help in that work.
Did such an unlikely politician influence your decision to run, having worked underneath him?
I mean, I always thought I would be a staff person. I never thought about running for office.
Did he encourage you to run?
I think he encouraged all of us to meet our potential and to not think of politicians in sort of he used to laugh when the term, he's not a blow-dried politician because, John was somewhat follically challenged. So
I know the feeling.
He'd get a good laugh out of that one.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I think he was a wonk before there was a term wonk, I think. And that's what I was. I loved the policy but it was like, okay, here's somebody who does all those things and he can run for office too. And so I didn't grow up thinking I wanted to be an elected official, but I was a poli-sci major. I wanted to work in public policy. But, seeing him and working with him gave me a different perspective on how you could do that role. So I think that's how I sort of got the courage to say I'm going to run for office.
What about you, Natalie Blais? Was John Olver influential in your decision to run for office? You worked for other candidates before John Olver and after, and then ran in 2018.
Yeah, like David, I also never thought of myself as a candidate or a politician for that matter. I think what we all learned from John is that this is about public service. It's about being a public servant. And that's why he was so good at what he did, because he was really driven by that. And to see him sort of step out beyond that, what he was, maybe get a little bit uncomfortable, also allowed me to consider doing the same. Because it was very difficult to be someone who was behind the scenes for as long as I was, to step out and be the person who was front and center. And I would much prefer to be a little bit more behind the scenes.
I don't know anything about that.
We're speaking with former mayor of Northampton, David Narkowitz, Representative Natalie Blais from the 1st Franklin District, and Patricia Lee Lewis, all of whom worked for the late Congressman John Olver, who passed away late last week at age 86 at his home in Amherst. He was a member of both chambers of the Massachusetts General Court, as they call it, on Beacon Hill, as well as a U.S. House member, until his retirement and the subsequent redistricting that made it possible for Jim McGovern then to be part of the representation in this part of the 413, as we like to call it. Patricia Lee Lewis, not only did you work for him in his office, but you were a lifelong friend up until his passing just last week. Tell us about who John Olver was as a man.
Well, David and Natalie have really told the truth about him. He was pretty much who he was on the outside and the inside. He was always extremely strategic person, I would say. Yeah. I met John and Rose, his wife, in 1968 when he was, I was just brand new in Northampton with a family and very much protesting the Vietnam War. And John was too, and he was going to run for the legislature. So I went down to his little office on Main Street in Northampton and picked up posters, as we did in those days, and found the bulletin boards. So that's how we got to meet, was putting our shoulders to the same wheels, I would say. Rose, when we were starting Every Woman's Center at the university in 1972, Rose was one of the very first faculty people to walk in. She was from Amherst College, certainly the first one from Amherst, and offer her help. John was very supportive of all the work that we did. Rose and I served on the Governor's Commission on the Status of Women, and John would always want to know what we'd done. Mrs. Dukakis was the governor then.
Uh-huh.
So it was over years. I was working in small farms, women in agriculture kind of issues, and rural economic development. We started Hilltown Community Development Corporation, for example. So I was a grassroots politician, you might say,
Yeah.
an organizer, advocate for certain things that John was always for, like the APR, the Agricultural Preservation Restrictions. That was a very big deal.
And kind of groundbreaking for its time, right?
It was groundbreaking.
It
was. Yeah. And he was for, of course, the bottle bill, but he also was for things like direct marketing that small farmers could do. And I was very much involved with that, whereas a lot of the farmers, big farmers, thought it was a kind of communist plot that we should do such things, and it was not
These farm
fair.
shares, I don't understand how that works.
Exactly. Thank God
Comrade.
they've changed their minds about that now, but this was a long time ago. So one night I was working at the Hilltown CDC. We had no staff yet, and I was trying to write a grant. It was like 10 or 11 at night, and anybody who ever worked for John will understand that it didn't matter what time of day or night it was. If John needed to talk to you, you would just be glad to talk to him. He did not have any boundaries whatsoever. And so I picked up the phone. Nobody. We were in Town Hall in Chesterfield at the time.
I can do the voice. Patricia.
Yes, exactly. And he would always introduce himself, no matter after 40 years. Patricia, this is John Olver. Who on earth else could it possibly be? And he said, I'd like for you to think about running for county commissioner. I said, well, tell me about what is a county commissioner, And he said, John Garvey was going to be sheriff, and he had been a county commissioner, and there was going to be a special election, and there'd never been a woman county commissioner in 325 years. And he wanted somebody to represent the rural communities, and he knew that's what I would do. And he said, this is the strategic part. He said, and I'm a state senator, and you would be a county commissioner, and Mount Tom is both state and county. And we could work together to get that, So I realized I was just another pawn in this wonderful game of getting things to work that should work, and said, well, I'll try. And sure enough, I won. And we really did work together on a lot of wonderful things. But, I loved the work. I'm like you two. I loved the work. I didn't love the great fundraisers and things, and I know he didn't either, but I was delighted some years later when he asked me to become his first economic development director when he got elected to the Congress. And it was because of this work with our small communities, and then the district director. And I just have to tell you, one of my best things I ever did was help him hire David Narkowitz to work on his staff on the economic development team. So, yeah, he as a man, was entirely unpredictable in so many ways, because his energy you would think the person must nearly be dead, of exhaustion. And here he would come with this project. But he also was incredibly personal. My son died actually 47 years ago today, so it's a little bit of a tough time for me right now. But my other two children and I were living on State Street then. It was 1976. And John just came over. He just came over, knocked on the door, came in. I don't know what time of night it was. I was still sitting on the sofa all by myself and watching the fire, and he just sat in a rocking chair, and he just sat there with me. And that was not an unusual thing for John to do. He just had a feeling. You wouldn't think he would have a great deal of empathy, because he was sometimes extremely blunt. And somebody said in some article I read the last couple of days, he suffered no fool, but he had a very strong heart and an empathetic way of being. When Rose died,
His wife, John Olver's wife.
when his wife died in 2014, I was already very close to their daughter Martha, who is now 53. And I have stayed that sort of like her, I don't know, her
aunt from Texas.
aunt from Texas.
Like a godmother.
Yeah.
A godmother, yeah. And I still am. And so I don't know how else to describe his heart except for the last few years, as David and I were talking about in the car coming over here, John's main concern was for Martha's welfare and how deeply that ran in him. And she certainly knows that. And many of us, certainly I, will always carry that on for him and for her.
Coming up, what do the late John Olver's aides, Representative Natalie Blais, former Mayor David Narkowitz, and author Patricia Lee Lewis think will be Olver's legacy? We'll hear more coming up on the Fabulous 413.
A truly huge man.
Figuratively
Remarkable
and
man.
literally. He was extremely tall.
He was extremely tall, yeah.
Patricia Lee Lewis, former county commissioner. I didn't even know that about your backstory, but also now well-known author, person responsible for getting David Narkowitz involved in John Olver's office. Also joining us is Natalie Blais, the elected representative from the 1st Franklin District on Beacon Hill. If people were to remember one thing about John Olver as we pay tribute to the man who passed away at the end of last week, what do you hope will be his lasting legacy, former Mayor David Narkowitz?
I was just about to push this over.
We can go to
No.
current state rep Natalie Blais. Just trying to pass them. Now I'm about to pass the mic.
Or lessons to retain with you. Like
Yeah.
things.
There's so many. I think that's what we're all struggling with right now is we learned so many lessons from him in terms of how to do this job and to do it in a way where you're always centering the people that you serve. We learned that a project was never going to be successful unless it was being driven by the community. As David said, he never came from the top down. Everything in our office came from the bottom up. And that's why so many of the projects and priorities that he undertook were successful in the end. And, John was deeply connected to nature. He was an avid rock climber up until very close to the end until he just couldn't do it anymore.
I remember you telling me you were getting ready to come visit me on the march for the food bank, and he wasn't going to come because he was already booked to be rock climbing, and this was like 3 years ago.
He loved being outdoors. He loved hiking with his friends. He loved being in nature. And I think when you look at the policies that he and the legislation that he sponsored, so much of it was around the protection of the environment. He really did an extraordinary job of breaking down silos, to look at the sustainable environment and recognize that housing and transportation and the climate were all connected. He did that in Washington for the very first time, saying, okay, agencies and departments, you have to work together to begin to break down those barriers and figure out how we're going to address these challenges, because we can't do it the way that we're doing it right now. It just won't be effective. So the way he thought, the strategic nature of his brain and how he thought about things was so interesting to learn, and certainly it all helped us to be very prepared, because he always expected us to know more than he did about any project. And he was so intelligent that it was impossible for any of us to get beyond where he already was. So, making sure that we were prepared, making sure that we are identifying the right people, and of course, just always being driven by the people that we serve.
From Representative Natalie Blais to former Mayor David Narkowitz, something you hope people will remember about the legacy of the late John Olver?
Yeah, I several of the stories I've read that just, his fingerprint, his imprint is sort of everywhere throughout Western and Central Massachusetts. And I think he He wasn't somebody that was trying to get attention for himself. I mean, there's some stuff named after him, but that was not something he sought or did it for that reason. I just think he was in public service for all the right reasons. He cared deeply about his country and about the communities that he represented. He cared deeply about issues. I think he thought the country could do better in so many ways, whether it was, poverty or education or preserving the environment or better transportation system. And then he gathered a lot of people around him, staff, but also the communities that he served, and found ways very adeptly. I mean, he was, even just the way he managed to get on the committees that people thought, well, why is he going on that committee? Like, what the heck is John Olver going on the Military Construction Appropriations Committee? And I think people were in an upheaval about it. But he was so strategic. He was thinking about how he was going to get to become, health, and how he was going to get to be transportation chair, because he knew he could do the most good there. So he was going to do what he could do where he was, but he knew that was going to get him to that end goal. And then leveraging his power on behalf of the people that sent him there. Not leveraging his power for himself or because he wanted to be a U.S. senator or because he had other aspirations, but really leveraging all that power that he had quietly and in a very mild-mannered way had amassed, and really sort of focusing it on the districts he served and for good.
From former Mayor David Narkowitz to Patricia Lee Lewis, longtime friend and staff member of the late John Olver.
So his legacy, that it's really possible to serve the people without putting yourself first, that integrity matters. And I was trying to think what I meant by integrity when I said something about that recently, that he was the person with the most integrity I've ever known. And that really had to do with his being clear about what he valued, what was important. And it was what needed help. The earth needed help. People needed help. People without health care needed help. Those community health centers were critical in his mind. People needed ways of getting places when they didn't have money. He started in Berkshire somewhere. He started a little bus system that was for people who couldn't get where they needed to get. And this morning I looked, Mass Live put a news story about him and photographs, a couple of which I hadn't seen. And then I toggled down and saw that there were comments coming in from people. And it was the most diverse. All these different things that we've been talking about. People from their personal lives were thanking him, including a couple of guys from Westover, to mentioning his work on the military committee. It was many years, of course. I mean, many politicians make a big difference in 44 years. Mm-hmm. To make so many into, Massachusetts isn't large. The district when we were serving with him was very large, although he lost Northampton for the second election. It was taken away from him, and every time we would drive through Northampton, he would say a word that I can't say on really upset him. That was something he lost. But that idea of being who you are. He was an introvert. He was not an extrovert. I remember going in fundraisers with him, Bill Newman's house one time.
Who? No, I'm just kidding. Head of the Western Mass Office of the ACLU and former co-host of a show that I love you, Bill Newman. Wow.
And there must have been like 100 people in their house. And John just walked in and walked to the next room and didn't say hello to anybody. He was thinking about something. So that kind of, since it's genuine, without artifice, intelligent, with a great sense of what is important in this world and the willingness to go after it. That's the kind of legacy. If we could all be like that, and I think these two people sitting next to me are, I'm not being insincere here. Mm-hmm. He fostered people like himself who were genuine carers. That's the legacy, I think.
I think his arrest record speaks to that as well.
Yeah. He was arrested several times protesting outside
For
of
good causes each time.
Yes.
Good trouble, as they would say.
That's right.
That's right.
Patricia Lee Lewis, Representative Natalie Blais, and former Mayor David Narkowitz, thank you so much for coming in today. I'm sure it's been tough, the loss of your friend and colleague and mentor on the passing of Representative John Olver, who passed last week at age 86 at his home in Amherst. Thank you so much.
Coming up, Chinese spy balloons may have started another UFO craze nationally, but we'll hear about how UFO sighting in the Berkshires got the attention of the Great Barrington Historical Society and former Governor Charlie Baker.
Plus, Dave Hayes, the weather nut on tonight's storm, all coming up in the Fabulous 413.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
Hampshire College astronomer, Dr. Salman Hamid, Mr. Universe. Years and years ago on my first show, On the River, I was talking about astronomy and my love of amateur astronomy. Not a science that I was into as a child, but I read A Brief History of Time, and it changed my whole perspective on science and science education and opened up my mind in a way that has been really exciting over these last few decades. And I said something wrong or stupid on the radio about the world of outer space, and you reached out to me and said, hey, I'm an astronomer from Hampshire College. You got that wrong. And I said, let's get together and talk about astronomy for the radio. And that forged a nearly 2 decades long conversation about astronomy. And we're here at your kitchen table in Amherst, surrounded by beautiful photos of the rings of Saturn and the surface of the moon.
Mars.
Oh, yeah, sorry. That's
See,
Mars.
there you go. That's a correction.
See? My first mistake already on the new show. It's red. I should have known it was Mars. I would love these conversations to continue because what you do so well is you are a science educator. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about specifically in regards to astronomy and one of our favorite topics, aliens, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, so I grew up in Pakistan, in Karachi, big city. So this is different from being in Western Massachusetts, certainly. And so I came here for my undergraduate. I got into astronomy because of Carl Sagan's Cosmos.
Yeah.
There are, in fact, 100 billion other galaxies, each of which contains something like 100 billion stars.
It was shown in Pakistan in 1984. I was in 9th grade. And just that first episode just blew me away, right? And I was like, okay, I want to be an astronomer. As it turns out, it takes a long time after that. So I came
You
here.
can't just watch the complete series Cosmos and then be an astronomer.
Although a lot of people now think that you can actually watch YouTube videos and you become an expert. But anyway, as it turns out, that is not the case. And I came here, and since I was coming from Pakistan, and there aren't not that many astronomers in Pakistan or opportunities for astronomy, so I came here for computer science. Or I should say, and here is my air quotes, computer science, because
Is that what you told your family?
that is exactly what I told my family. And to be frank, I didn't know if I would like it or not, right? I mean, actual astronomy, research astronomy can be different, but I loved it. And so I was in New York, I was in Stony Brook, and then I went to graduate school to New Mexico, and my research for my PhD was as mainstream astronomy as possible. I looked for how stars form in spiral galaxies. And
That's what your thesis was in.
that was my thesis, and I used telescopes in Chile, in New Mexico, in Arizona, in Hawaii, in the Spanish Canary Islands, so loved it. And then for my postdoc, I actually came here to the Valley. It was a joint position between UMass Amherst and Smith College. So it was a fellowship of 5-college astronomy department fellowship. And they asked me to develop a course on astronomy and public policy. And I had never been to a liberal arts college. I went to public schools. And in fact, I remember, and at that time, I don't know if it was Google or Yahoo maybe, or whatever it was, search engine.
Ask Jeeves?
I actually had to literally search for, what is a liberal arts college?
Yeah.
Because in Pakistan, we're not familiar with that. And here I wasn't. And I was in astronomy department. I mean, we didn't want to talk to physicists. Like, when I was in grad school, like, hey, we are astronomers. We don't talk to anybody outside our field. And so being in liberal arts college, being at Smith, that was life-changing because suddenly you're talking to people who are like really interested in other fields, and that led to my interest in interdisciplinary work. And just fortunate that when I finished, I was 4 years I was at Smith and UMass, that I got a position at Hampshire College that position was an endowed position, very broad. It was like integrated science and humanities. That allowed me to teach courses that are don't follow a specific sort of like discipline. And I developed a course called Aliens, Close Encounters of a Multidisciplinary Kind, where we talk about sort of like all different aspects of how people think about aliens, from history, because people have been making claims about UFOs, to religion, because there are some people who believe sort of like in UFO religion, UFO abductions, and also search for life in the universe. But my research moved more in the direction of science and society. And a lot of my work is in how, especially in Muslim societies, how people think about modern science. And I used biological evolution as sort of like, as a probe to think about these things. But astronomy has always stayed close. I've been connected with you as well in terms of popular astronomy. I've been connected with Pakistan as well in terms of popular astronomy.
You're like the Carl Sagan of Pakistan right now in some ways, because you have like a web series in Urdu that is communicating science in the same and astronomy in the same way that Carl Sagan was doing it in English and that you saw in Karachi in the 80s.
हेलो कायनातीस, आजकल हमारे सोलर सिस्टम या हमारे निज़ाम शमसी के अंदरून की तरफ एक कॉमेट.
Well, that's very kind of you, but yes, I mean I do create these videos, and one of the goals of those videos is precisely that I actually never met Carl Sagan in person. And to me that's a little puzzling, that the most influential person in many ways on my life, like who completely changed my direction, and I'm talking to you right now because of that first episode of Cosmos that I watched in 1984, but I never met that person. He was just on television. Mm-hmm. To me, that is actually a perplexing thing, a puzzling thing. And so I started creating these videos to a certain degree with a little hope that Sagan did not belong to my culture. He looked different, and I was privileged enough to understand a bit of English and so on and so forth, but a lot of people don't. And so they can see somebody who's like them and like, think, hey, he can do PhD, so can I, kind of a thing. And so that's where sort of like, create these videos. And also, we are also now broadening the same video aspect, and we'll be creating actually videos for in collaboration with International Astronomical Union.
The people that killed Pluto.
Oh, yeah, I know. I cannot, in those videos, I don't think I'm collaborating with them. I think I'll have to be careful. I will have to censor myself.
Because they voted to kill Pluto as a union of astronomers, saying, not without total just cause, Pluto is smaller than our moon, right? It doesn't clear its own orbit of debris given its gravitational pull. I at least know that.
Okay, this is a longer conversation which we will have, but I should mention that in Fabulous 413, Pluto is a planet.
Okay, cool.
So
we accept all different types of planets here in Western Massachusetts. That's the kind of inclusive area we live.
Exactly. And so these videos are going to be in English. So and some of that focus is also going to be another topic which I think is crucial. It's important, and that is about how humans are going to space and settle in space. Mm-hmm. And that is a topic which things are happening. I mean, there are questions about moon base coming up. It's within the next decade. Things are going to happen on the moon, at least, like, in terms of human settlement or human presence, bases probably, and then, of course, potentially on Mars. But I don't think we are having enough conversations about the type of challenges it brings, the kind of ethical issues and moral issues that we ought to think about. Should billionaires sort of like set all the rules? And coming from South Asia, we know actually the corporate aspect where it can lead, from the British East India Company, which only wanted a little trading post, like in the 18th century, and what happened after that. So I think it's a really crucial time, because we are going to go to space, or we are going to take those first steps at a permanent basis once. Meaning to say, once we set up rules, then the later expansion is probably going to be that I am, personally, I'm an optimistic person. But on the other hand, regarding this aspect, I'm actually quite pessimist, because I think the momentum and the idealism is missing. The momentum is in the direction of we are going to be doing in space what we have been doing on Earth.
Colonization.
And
Cold War.
And Cold War, exactly. And purely sort of like, unadulterated capitalism, where like, it's the for profits.
Not like New England public media.
No, exactly.
I've come from the for-profit world to the non-profit world.
Exactly. And so I mean, that would be great, like, that if we can maintain, and there are some good things that, for example, the only treaty that everybody agrees on or everybody signed up to regarding outer space was the Outer Space Treaty, which was in 1967, which is actually pretty idealistic, but also a bit ambiguous. I would love to have that idealism, and somehow right now that type of thing is missing. But I'm hoping that in this show we'll talk a lot about these things. So that's another topic which, from the astronomy perspective, from the space perspective, I really want to bring the human aspect, not the sort of the technical aspects. I'm curious about sort of like the cultural, societal factors that are going to impact, that we ought to think about when we think about going to space.
I'm at the kitchen table in Amherst of Hampshire College and Five College astronomer Dr. Salman Hamid, who I lovingly call Mr. Universe, not because of his physique, but you're not far off. And we love to talk about science and astronomy in particular, and when, there's a big meteor shower happening, or maybe there is a meteor that's coming close to Earth, we'll talk about those sort of things, anything that's going on in the sky, and anything that you might have a question about. We'd love to ask Mr. Universe, our resident astronomer. You can email us any questions, or even send a voice memo to thefab413@nepm.org. And I wanted our first segment, apart from just being in Amherst in your lovely kitchen, not far from where you teach, to have some sort of grounding in the 413. Now, I know from you that the Big Bang happened everywhere. So we could talk about the Big Bang and still be talking about the 413. That's a topic for another discussion, but it's fascinating. One thing that has been the news lately is UFOs. The United States, with an F-22, I believe, out of Westfield, shoots down a Chinese balloon, and then all of a sudden, several days later, all of these other UFOs are getting shot down over Canada, over the United States, and aliens starts trending on Twitter. Aliens is one of our favorite topics. Full disclosure, I believe that aliens, intelligent life, or at least life, must exist outside of this planet. And I believe you believe that too. But what you have taught me over the years is we have no evidence that that's true. Talk to me about our recent spate of UFO sightings and the discussion about aliens that very quickly came up after it.
It's a sad story. And the reason is because, in general, people who actually look for alien signatures, they actually haven't come out and said, this is it. Let's pull back, let's focus on this because we've been looking for SETI or we've been looking for life on Mars. This is a much bigger thing. Let's focus on that. That hasn't happened.
We're still sending spacecraft to Mars to go through the dirt to hopefully find a dead bacteria or something like that. That is where the actual research is being done. So all of the hoopla surrounding what these things that are unidentified, potentially flying, and potentially objects, better described as unidentified aerial phenomena, things in the sky, to jump to aliens is bold. And Carl Sagan had a quote that you probably remember much better than I do about these bold claims.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
To bring this back to the 413, there is a monument in Sheffield, Massachusetts, signed off by Governor Charlie Baker, that indicates that there was an alien encounter in Sheffield, right near the covered bridge, in 1969. And that's what's grounding it, not just in the fact that 413 is part of the Big Bang and all astronomy, we're a planet, we can really talk about whatever we want. But Sheffield, Massachusetts is the home of an extraordinary claim about aliens.
The interesting aspect about this story is that the Great Barrington Historical Society gave it its blessing. They actually officially recognized this, experience or sighting, which was seen apparently by multiple people. The central character in here is Tom Reed, who was 6 years old at that time. And but it wasn't the only one. Other people also saw it. There was also people some talked to on the radio. They called on the radio to talk about it.
There was a small radio station there where people started calling in away.
And they also mentioned. So
there's a great piece from WGBH, our parent company, about this very thing.
Okay, all right, great.
Shameless plug.
So this is one of those things that I want to differentiate between people believing they saw something, people believing that they saw an alien spacecraft or aliens, versus are there aliens out there or are there spacecrafts that are visiting the Earth? I think people do believe that they actually see things. And in fact, it's actually quite common. I was just reading recently, there was an incident at the end of the World War II as well, in 1945, on one of the US naval ships. They actually said, they thought that it was a Japanese balloon, talking about balloons, or some Japanese spacecraft. They were considering shooting it down, whereas the person said, actually, I think it's Venus. So
don't try to shoot down Venus.
Right. So, but this is one of those things that if you are in a little bit of a mode of hysteria, then you start seeing other things and it can impact. So September of 1969, when this UFO incident happened, this was a few months after moon landing. So you can imagine sort of that aspect coming in as well. So the common themes in these type of things is about, and this was also mentioned with the Great Barrington Historical Society, that said that it was credible, and a lot of people saw that, and we believe it, that this actually happened. But that is not how science works. That is not enough, especially for something, a claim as big as aliens, to say this is it, right? So you can be a Nobel laureate and you come out and say X. You don't have to.
Or maybe Q.
Or Q. You don't have, that's right. You don't have to accept it. And we are trained in that context to a certain degree that if it's a bigger claim, you actually challenge that. And it doesn't matter who makes that claim. Stephen Hawking has been wrong about certain things. Einstein has been wrong about certain things. It's not enough that the people who are making the claim are credible, because they may not be lying, but they may be mistaken. And in order to show that is something there, just imagine we're talking about Mars and microbes. You don't just say, oh, I don't know, this looks kind of like a microbe. Why not? Because I want to believe in it. It's not that scientists don't want to believe that there is life, but we want to be sure, especially because if you want to believe in it, you have to be even more skeptical. You are not being fooled.
There is that fine line, Hampshire College astronomer Dr. Salman Hamid, Mr. Universe, between faith and science. And part of the interdisciplinary things that you teach have to do with those perspectives. And we're not trying to say that this person in 1969 didn't see something, that those people in Sheffield didn't see something. All you're saying from the scientific perspective is, that's great, you had an experience, maybe there's a monument there, perhaps don't get the governor to sign off that it was aliens, because that becomes problematic. Don't get the Historical Society to sign off to say it was aliens, because there's no proof that it was aliens. There's a claim. People have all sorts of claims about things that they see, things that they believe from a religious perspective or not. All that's well and good. That's not science.
And the monument, if I remember correctly, has been removed from it.
Or at least moved off of what was state property.
Right. And so I think the issue is more the Great Barrington Historical Society confirming that the experience, not the experience was real, but what they saw, the claim was true, right? And I think there is a distinction, and I think that's very important, because people can also have a meaning out of it. And I teach about alien abductions, and people who claim to have been abducted by aliens, they actually really believe that it's true, and they have a lot of meaning attached to it. And I think that is important to acknowledge that. And I think if you say whether that happened, it depends upon what are you talking about. Did the experience happen? And I would say absolutely. That is true. But there is a separate question if you say, but were there aliens that abducted these people from Earth? Well, that's a different question, and for which we don't have enough evidence. Or we don't have evidence for that. There are alternative explanations that are simpler. Are those things alien spacecrafts? And for that, the evidence has to be stronger. Eyewitness testimony is actually not good enough in science. For that, you need better evidence.
These are the kind of conversations we're going to continue to have here on this show. If you have a question for our resident astronomer, Dr. Salman Hamid, about the breadth and depth of all things astronomy, or the Cold War brewing between the United States and China on the moon, or Chinese spy balloons, or
science fiction films,
right?
Or or
former president of the Amherst Cinema, right here.
Right, and so I love films, and sort of especially that tackle these type of questions.
Send us your questions, and we'll ask them on a future show. The Fab413@nepm.org. Thank you, Mr. Universe.
Thank you very much.
Bob Krull, the current executive director of the Great Barrington Historical Society, gave us a statement on the controversial alien sighting monument. He writes, If you haven't seen the Netflix program Unsolved Mysteries, the Berkshire County UFO incident, I suggest you do so. It is a very informative program that highlights the reported events of September 1st, 1969. The Great Barrington Historical Society has no affiliation with the monument in Sheffield. As to the events of that day, we have documented some of the reports that suggest that something unusual occurred that day. Exactly what remains an unsolved mystery.
Coming up, we shift from meteor showers to snow showers. We'll talk 4-county forecast with the 413's favorite armchair meteorologist, Dave Hayes, the Weather Nut.
We're joined by someone whose passion for the skies has become our occasional lifeline in trying weather systems. For years, folks have looked to his post to find out more about what's happening in our region and about how weather works in general, which is how I now know what grapple is. Joining us now to talk more about our impending snow-filled doom is Florence, Mass's own Dave Hayes, the Weather
Wait
Nut.
a minute. Dave Hayes is famous for not having inflammatory forecasts that include words like doom, but thank you for joining us, Dave Hayes, the Weather Nut. Is this a doom storm?
No. This is not a doom storm. It's kind of a run-of-the-mill snowstorm. Not a blockbuster, not a little wimpy thing, but we're definitely going to have the plows come out.
Okay, so there are 4 counties in Western Mass. When we've had you on previously, we had a very small swathe of our area, but now we've got all 4 counties. How's this storm going to look different in Berkshire County versus where we are right now in Hampden County, let's say?
Yeah, well, we've got winter storm warnings out from the National Weather Service for all 4 counties. And except, I think the areas in like the eastern Berkshires, the western hill towns, especially western Hampshire and western Hampden County, are probably going to see more like 6 to 10 inches because there's going to be a southeasterly flow of wind that will enhance the precipitation over those areas. Whereas the valley itself will probably be more like 4 to 7 inches, I'm thinking.
The triangle of snow disappointment, as you've called it.
Yeah, is that what you call it?
Yeah. It's with this kind of it's not so much with this storm. It feels like this is going to be a more kind of widespread, moderate snowfall, like a nice 4, 5, 6, 7 inches of snow. I've seen other storms in the Triangle of Disappointment, which is the Pioneer Valley, where places in the Berkshires get 10 inches of snow and we get like 1 inch of snow. So it's not going to be that drastic. There'll definitely be more in the Berkshires and the Western Hill towns, but we'll get some snow too here in the valley.
So it seems like, as our engineer Betsy Curtis is asking, this snow might be good for snowmen and or sledding?
Well, I think the reality is that most of the snow's going to start moving in between like 8 p.m. and midnight from west to east. And it's going to be pretty dry and fluffy, I think, at first. And then towards tomorrow, the bulk of the heaviest and steadiest of the snow falls between like 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And then it should lighten up a bit as you get later in the morning tomorrow and through the afternoon. That's when it would get a little bit wetter and be like, better for snowmen and all that kind of thing. But the thing is that the bulk of the snow will have already accumulated by that time.
So no late night snowmen, but later in the day tomorrow we could be able to be making snowmen.
It's possible. That's right. It's possible, but most of it should be pretty fluffy, which is good because it's easier to move. Kind of like the snow we had over the weekend on Saturday. We got like 1 to 3 inches of floof, as I call it, and you can take a broom to it and push it around.
The real fun snow globey stuff.
Yeah.
Yes, dendrites. We love dendrites.
What's a dendrite? Weather nerd.
Dendrite is just it's a type of snowflake, and dendrites are basically like the really ornamental crystals. If you look at them close, they're kind of like the 3-dimensional snowflakes. There's other things like plates and columns, which are more flatter. They don't stack up as quick. The dendrites stack up really fast, so it really depends on the kind of snowflake that you get in terms of it plays into figure out how much is going to accumulate on the ground.
Dave Hayes, the Weather Nut, has 52,000 plus followers on Facebook. He's also on other social medias. He is funded by you, our listeners, and the people who want to keep his forecast going. You can support his forecast at westernmassweather.com. And this Thursday, you can watch Khalees and I interview Dave Hayes, the Weather Nut, for Connecting Point on NEPM TV at 7:30.
We get to talk to him about his music, and you get to hear me play guitar very badly.
I think it's great. Well, thank you, Dave Hayes, the Weather Nut, for giving us an update on the storm. We may need to call on your services again tomorrow. We'll see.
Please do, and thanks for having me. Take care, guys.
You too.
Tomorrow on the show, a tour of the Springfield-based Mi Tierra Tortilla Factory to show you how the tortilla gets made.
A preview of the Back Porch Music Festival taking over downtown Northampton next weekend, and how the festival has partnered with the city of Northampton to keep live music flourishing in Hamp.
And I will face one of my greatest fears, extreme cold, as I take a polar plunge with Northampton city councilors, a famous author, and local rock stars.
Better you than me. Musical thank yous to local heroes Spouse, Happy Valley Guitar Orchestra, Mal Devisa, Suitcase Junket, and the Fawns.
Our director and shepherd of guests is Tony Dunn.
Our engineer is Betsy Cortis.
Sledding enthusiast.
Indeed.
Our technical team is Kara Foster, Bart Rankin, and Punk Dubé. I'm Monty Belmonte.
I'm Clese Smith.
See you tomorrow in the Fabulous 413.